Greetings, everyone. Today I've got a guest I haven't spoken to for quite a while, far too long, one might argue. Ed Dutton, who's an extremely clever fellow who knows about sort of anthropology and all that sort of stuff. And today we're going to talk about why our Prime Minister and previous Prime Ministers are all barking, gibbering mad, which is not, in point of fact, a technical term, but I think we'll all agree that that is the case. And it seems to be Starmer in particular and other politicians that have gone before, and some of Starmer's own cabinet seem to have psychological problems, which it doesn't matter if it's the loony throwing stones at the ducks in the park, but it's a bit dodgy when the fellow's got a finger on a red nuclear button. Anyway, I'll ask Ed Dutton to say a few words about himself to bring you up to speed if you haven't had the pleasure of watching his podcast, which are jolly good. We'll be putting the link. The link will be down there, and I think you'll find him well worth watching and quite funny and amusing and all that kind of thing. So marvelous. Well, okay, let's kick it off, dear boy, and see what's what. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're a Durham man.
Hi, yes, hi, Godfrey. Good to see you again. I remember the last time we were on together, we were on my channel discussing Winston Churchill and his various psychological flaws. Yeah, hi, my name's Ed Dutton. I have a YouTube channel called The Jolly Heretic, where I like to look at what I call based science, i.e., science that is based in the empirical reality and is not influenced by wokeness and political correctness and suppressing the truth and so on. I'm an academic. I'm a professor of evolutionary psychology of business at Aspro University in Poland, and I'm an honorary professor in the Institute of Psychology at the Russian Academy of Sciences. I've been cancelled various times by Western academia, and I've written many books, about 20 books, and the most recent one is called Woke Eugenics: How Social Justice is a Mask for Social Darwinism. And yeah, so that's it. So how do you do it? It's good to be on again.
Well, that's marvelous. I'd actually momentarily forgotten that we did Winston Churchill, and funny enough, I did a little bit of that on Lotus Eaters just a little while ago, but we don't want to go down that rabbit hole just at the moment, because we've got to stick to what we're stuck with at the moment. Now, I came into politics late in life myself from a city career, and I always thought there was something behind the green baize door when these politicians made decisions on information which I didn't have. And so they were making decisions, and I was in the dark, and that they weren't mad. This is what it was. And of course, after 10 years in politics, I realized they were completely barking bloody mad. And Starmer's not alone. But let's start with Starmer. Give us your take on the dead eyes, the total lack of charisma, the bizarre interviews he's had since he's been caught with his hand in the till, quite unlike how most of us would react. The ordinary Joe, if he gets caught with his hand in the cookie jar, goes a bit bright red and stumbles and stutters. But God, Starmer, tell us all about it.
Well, I should emphasize that although I'm a professor of evolutionary psychology, I'm not actually a psychologist. I'm not a clinician or anything like that. So I'm just going on my reading on this. But as far as I can see, Keir Starmer has suffered from what is called parentalization. There is a very telling interview with him in The Guardian, where he noted that he doesn't have a favorite poem, he doesn't have a favorite novel, he doesn't, in his words, go down the dark alleys of thinking about the sort of difficult sides of himself. He noted that when he was a child in Oxted in Surrey, there wasn't much room for emotion or expressing feelings. And he said, and he indicated that a lot of his childhood was dominated by the fact that his mother had Still's disease, which is a crippling form of arthritis. And so everything had to be essentially based around her and her needs. And even when they'd go on holiday to the Lake District or go on holiday to the seaside, you couldn't really go and have fun and go to the seaside because it was all based around what mother could do. So it's as though he's been taught not to express Emotions. He talks about just plowing through life. He used that metaphor. Not to express emotions, not to think about how he feels, and all this sort of thing. Now that is consistent with him being parentalized. That is to say, he's in this difficult situation where he's got this mother who's extremely ill. And he's probably been taught from a young age that you don't get mother too tired, don't get mother too stressed, be careful of mother, or you're a good boy, you're so mature, you're helping to look after mother. He's been basically forced by virtue of having a disabled mother to adopt the role of a parent to help look after the mother. And parentalization is extremely bad psychologically because the child is not meant to be a parent. The child is meant to have parents. And so the child finds it very difficult to cope with the stress of being a parent. It feels that there isn't a loving world that is looking after it. It is looking after somebody else. And also the child is being taught in order to help look after the child, the parent, in a sense, not to be a child. Don't explore your emotions. Don't explore how you feel and different aspects of yourself. Don't do that. Focus on being a kind of mini adult in order to help look after mother. You can imagine him being told by his father, "Oh, well, you don't get mother too upset. Be careful of mother." Or that shouldn't be the situation. It should be the other way round. Now, this is very stressful for the child, and it teaches the child that the world is a kind of unstable, unpredictable, harsh, unloving kind of place. And so this makes the child very, very high in anxiety. And the child is also not able to explore these emotions, these strong emotions it might have, and not able to come up with coping mechanisms to help it deal with these emotions because it's not able to explore and express these emotions. He actually said there wasn't much room for emotional expression in my home when I was a child. So you end up with a person who is extremely high in anxiety, who sees the world as an unstable place, who creates insecure attachments to other people. What you really have is almost like post-traumatic stress disorder, or comparable to what's known as borderline personality disorder, which is where you have people that have a fundamental, it's more common in women, but a fundamental fear of abandonment. And they deal with this and they have very, very strong emotions that they can't regulate, in his case, because they've never learned to regulate them. And so then they have problems with identity and they swing between things and whatever. What's more likely to happen with a male that's put in that situation is that he adopts narcissistic personality disorder. This is where you deal with all of these negative feelings that you have, all of this sense that the world is unstable, this sense that you're not good enough, this sense that you might be abandoned, all this sort of thing, that there's no one there to look after you, there's no mummy and dad to look after you, you're looking after them. By telling yourself that you're adopting this false self, telling yourself that you're brilliant, that you're perfect, that you're wonderful, that you're entitled, that you're better than other people, that you're morally superior to other people, that you're all this sort of thing. And I suspect that's what he's done. Now, the problem to cope with all of these difficult and conflicted feelings, and then also, of course, he's going to have a lack of emotional regulation because he's never been allowed to experiment with emotions and thus learn to regulate them. He's had to sort of suppress them. So I think that's probably what he's done. This adopted this narcissistic, morally superior, hardworking, better than everybody else, entitled self. And then this is reflected in his behavior. So one, obviously you have this sense that he's better than everybody else, that he's entitled, he deserves £107,000 of free gifts, even though he's telling everybody else that he's a socialist and that they should be, the equality and all this stuff. He's above that. He's better than everybody else. Two, the moral superiority that you saw in response to the riots and so forth, though that they're just far right thugs and so on. Three, I feel he was triggered by those riots. The riots were his power, his importance, his idea of himself as superior being questioned by these disgusting, as his would see it, working class yobbos, thugs. And I think this triggered him, and he felt very strong emotions. But unlike someone like Tony Blair, he'd never been able to come up with ways of dealing with those emotions. So he responded viscerally your far-right thugs. Whereas it seems to be quite obvious that Tony Blair would have responded in a far more diplomatic and sensible and cautious fashion, much as we may dislike Tony Blair. But he knew how to behave and how to cope with this situation. And then finally, what's come out yesterday, this is reflective of a person, that's sort of narcissistic and high in psychopathic traits, just feels they're great, and so if they want to behave like that, then they will. But B, it reflects an idea that sort of almost, if you feel that the world is an insecure and difficult place, and you haven't grown up to feel loved, then you might kind of feel that love, if it manifests, might not come along again. So don't look a gift horse in the mouth. So you can see how someone like that might behave like that. So that's my interpretation of Starmer, and in some ways I feel rather sorry for him.
It's interesting that it seems to me that this is a trait in some way, Professor, with all these senior politicians. It seemed to me after just 10 years in politics, and I went into it very late in life as a city fund manager, it seems to me that they all have some of these traits in common, and I'm not quite sure whether they're born with them or they develop them, because in politics, unlike the army, where I spent a short spell in the army, you want the best corporals, you want the best sergeants, you want the best people around you because you're totally interdependent. But in politics, your enemy, if you are a senior politician in the Conservative Party, for example, your enemy is not a senior politician in the Labour Party. Your enemy is somebody who wants your job in your own party. So it seems to me politics breeds this feeling of paranoia, if you will, and that although if you scrape the surface, they're all the same underneath, some of them handle this problem better than others. As you said, like Blair, who I think underneath has a lot of the same problems, but actually is much easier at covering them up and dealing with them, perhaps. Am I right in that? Am I wrong in that?
Yeah, I think you make a number of good points. I think first of all, we should distinguish between the career politician and the kind of person who goes into it because they're asked. So the kind of person that goes into it because they're asked to, and who is likely to go into it late in life. An example would be a guy called, I think his name was Dr. Richard Taylor, who was the MP for Kidderminster Hospital Health Concern.
Yes, remember him, yeah.
This is absolutely not a career politician. So that's going to be a person who is reasonably intelligent and is high in what we call general, but is not particularly Machiavellian, not particularly ambitious. And they're going to be high in what's called general factor of personality. So such a person you would expect to be high in agreeableness, high in conscientiousness, that's to say impulse control, rule following, low in neuroticism, i.e. mentally stable, and perhaps high in extroversion because they've got to be a good speaker and things like this. And such a person will go into politics late, they will be asked to do so, and they will be, conscientious and so forth. And so there's someone like that. Now, what's very different from that is the kind of person that wants to go into politics from a very young age. That kind of person is Machiavellian. They want power, and they want prestige. And so that would militate in favor of a person that has what's called dark triad traits. There are 3 interrelated dark triad traits. They correlate at about 0.5, and they are about 50% genetic. And these are Machiavellianism, i.e. that you are power hungry, narcissism, i.e. that you are grandiose and puffed up and think that you're great and you're better than other people, and psychopathology, i.e. that you are low in empathy and you are highly manipulative. Being socioeconomically successful, including, I assume, being successful in politics, is associated with general factor of personality plus high intelligence. But being really, really successful, like mega successful, that is associated with extremely high intelligence, or there's balances of these, though, combined with dark triad traits, i.e. psychopathology, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. So we can distinguish between these 2 kinds of people. And I would expect, as I say, the certain kinds of career politician, and particularly those that have the steel to get right to the top and to be of the latter kind, to be this combination of dark triad traits and intelligence. And that's what you see, I think, with someone like Winston Churchill. And these, I mean, probably with Tony Blair, but maybe he's just much more socially skilled than Starmer. There are a number of factors that predict being. There was a very interesting paper by someone called Felix Post. It was called "Creativity and Psychopathology: A Study of 291 Great Men." And he found that psychopathy was hugely overrepresented among these people, among politicians, but to an even greater extent among artists and people like that. And there are a number of things which will, at the environmental level, which will elevate these kinds of traits. One of them is a difficult childhood, which I suspect that Starmer had because he was parentalized and he had a very sick mother. Or Tony Blair, his father died when he was quite young. So these are the kind of things that will elevate these traits, that will make the world seem like an unstable place, and will make you anxious and will make you insecure and will make you adopt a sort of false narcissistic self. And as I think you see with Tony Blair, and I think you also see with Keir Starmer. So there's those. So there's. But secondly, as you say about the thing in the army, you know, the importance of the interrelationship. That is true. But you could also argue that it's true that among politicians, yes, your enemy is the person that wants your job, but also it's true that you have to make a coalition with like-minded people, and your enemy is also the opposition. So there's that balance. There's that balance all the time. I suppose you could argue that for ambitious soldiers, it's the same. Your enemy is the enemy, but your enemy is also the person who's competing with you to get the promotion. So there's an element to which that's true even there. But I think I'm not surprised at what you found as a person that went in late and presumably was just sort of got involved in UKIP and late and so forth. That there would be, I would think there would be these two kinds of politician. And I can imagine it. Like, imagine the person that just puts themselves forward for an unwinnable seat because they're a party worker and they feel they're doing their bit. And they, you know, they feel they're doing their bit. They're just a party worker, you know, and hardly anybody is applying to be the candidate for that seat because it's unwinnable. And they just put themselves forward and they find themselves elected because it's a landslide. Right? You're going to get that kind of politician. And then you're going to get the ones, which is most of the ones that become famous. I mean, if you read John Major's memoirs, for example, he tries and tries and tries and tries continuously and doesn't give up. So you've got to have perhaps the sort of slightly narcissistic sort of sense of your own importance to just never give up, no knockbacks. You know, the knockbacks happen, you keep going. And then eventually he gets selected for a winnable seat, and after trying for more than a decade. And finally he's elected to Parliament. So yeah, you would expect those kinds of people to ascend to positions of power. And perhaps it's even more the case now than it used to be, because we have a sort of elite over promotion effect whereby people in the old, you know, in general, to get to be an MP, putting aside the Labour Party, the trade union movement, you had to be rich. And the salary was very low. Ken Clarke talks about when he was first elected that he had to work as a barrister as well as being an MP to sustain his lifestyle, and he'd do things like sleep on benches at railway stations. So it's unbelievable, you know. Whereas now you've got a situation where, and it used to be that people would become MPs because they were gentry, because they knew the right people, all this sort of thing. Now it's much more that it's going to be people that are highly Machiavellian. Now that we have a more meritocratic system, that are going to end up as MPs. So we're going to get MPs that are, in a sense, less representative psychologically of the population and just more psychopathic.
You mentioned a figure, 50%. I'd be interested to explore what the parental or social pressure is on some of these people. I mean, we know that Winston Churchill had a very difficult relationship with his father. We would suspect, would we not, that Boris Johnson had a difficult relationship with his father because his father had an aggressive violence towards his mother. So that must have been although he handles this socially very much better, but almost more Machiavellian, because the portrait that Boris Johnson, for you know, an affable, big, blonde-headed sort of chap, gives that impression to a lot of people and most people. And he won the mayor. He became mayor of London, I think, really based on that good old Boris kind of thing. But here we're dealing, are we not, with a person? Let's just deal with something in recent history. There was a peace agreement in April 2022 in Turkey between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. It was signed. It was a done deal. It was there. Now, here's an interesting point, and I come to this as a geopolitical military strategist, which is my background. What is actually fascinating is he seems to have no guilt. Most of us now, as we see things now, with another 400,000 odd casualties in the Ukraine of young men, young Ukrainian soldiers, young Russian soldiers to a much lesser extent, you would think if you'd scuppered that peace agreement in April 2022, you would have some form of guilt. You would have some form of problem if we did something like that. And I still get guilt about some of my behavior as a teenager. I think what a nasty little piece of work I was, or how I didn't do this, or I could have been more helpful to my parents if I'd done this, that, and the other. I suspect perfectly normal, because all teenagers are evil. And hopefully I've grown out of that. But we all get guilty if we do something wrong. If we get caught with our hand in the cookie jar or something, most of us would react in a different way. And so it also seems, and add an addendum to that question, it seems that society does not hold you to blame for anything anyway. I mean, Boris Johnson went from a ghastly failed prime minister, breaking up a peace agreement with Ukraine and the Russian Federation, to become the over-editor of the Daily Telegraph newspapers, a position of some importance. He must have been given that role by somebody who does not regard these problems with people's psychological problems or psychopathic problems. They brush them under the carpet. It all seems to be brushed under the carpet. Nobody seems to hold these people to any form of account.
It seems to me that if we go back sort of 50, 100 years, then most people that were working, in a sense, were humbler. They didn't have a sense that they could rise particularly high. They had a sense that they were part of a certain social class. My grandfather would always say, well, I'm working class or lower middle class or whatever. And it never occurred to them to even try to attain positions of power. It was much more a class-based society. It didn't cross your mind that you would move, particularly apart from a small number of probably very Machiavellian and highly intelligent people, like the Thomas Cromwell types, that you could move out of your social class. There wasn't the structures in place to help you to do so. There wasn't systems that assisted bright people, like grammar schools, bright people from the working class or lower middle class to get into the elite. And so you had an elite whereby people who probably weren't that ambitious would be, would end up becoming members of parliament because it was just sort of a thing that their family did or whatever, and there'd be no candidates up against them, and you didn't have to be particularly Machiavellian to get into these kinds of situations. Whereas now we have a situation where we have created, to a great extent, a meritocracy, where we are told that we are all equal, where it isn't instilled into you that if you are of a certain social class, realistically, you're not going to be able to do this and you're not going to be able to do that. Everything is done to try and persuade you that, you go to university and all this. And so you have then lots and lots of people that have been to university. Once they've been to university, they have this feeling that they're part of the elite. They're not really, but they have this feeling that they are. And so therefore they have a high level of ambition and an entitlement. And then you get more and more people applying for positions of power, for a limited number of positions of power. You have elite over promotion. You have a set number of positions of power, 650 MPs. But lots and lots of people that via their education or whatever feel that they're entitled and feel they should have these positions. And then it becomes highly competitive. And then who is going to win in that intense competition other than people that are absolutely highly intelligent, dark triad people, basically, who are highly Machiavellian, highly manipulative, and are able to get through this intensely competitive process. So that's what you would expect to happen. Now, contrast this with someone like this guy, who was born into a noble family, who inherited his seat in the House of Lords, obviously, who was vaguely interested in politics, and so got out of the army and went into the House of the Lords, but had been brought up all his life with probably not that ambitious, really, and not that dark triad, just a guy with high general factor of personality. It shines through in the book. And then when something goes wrong, even though it's not his fault, i.e. the Falklands are invaded, he feels that he must resign out of a sense of honor, that this I'm the foreign secretary, this calamity has happened on my watch, I will resign. Now you just don't get that now. This sense that well, I must take responsibility, because these people that were instilled with the sense of you're the aristocracy, you're going to rule, and you have an obligation towards the rest of society, the noblesse oblige. They're just gone. They're just gone. And so what you end up with in a meritocratic democratic system, to a great extent, is these kinds of Machiavellian characters. As for Boris, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like Keir Starmer is Boris, but with none of the positive sides. So what you have with Boris Johnson's father, I think, as well. Isn't it amazing? And this guy, we all know, he's knocked his wife about. He had lots of affairs. He's obviously a bit of a filthy fellow, really. But yet he's able to go on telly. He's able to be on. There was some fly on the wall documentary about celebrities moving to India to retire. I forget what it was called. That he was on. And he comes across jolly well and all this sort of thing. Minor media character. And his son evidently has inherited those kinds of traits. His son is like Churchill in a lot of ways, I think. That's why he wrote this book, The Churchill Factor. He identifies with Churchill, and he should, because he's like him. So you've got a person that's had a very difficult childhood, that's probably inherited dark triad traits anyway, that's had this very difficult childhood, that's become this narcissist, that's adopted a false self. And that's seen very, the narcissistic false self, where you tell yourself that you're perfect and whatever, and you ooze charisma and everyone likes you. And he's very consciously done that, down to, because one of the things with borderline personality people, which is that relates to narcissism, that you have an unstable sense of who you are, that you fear abandonment, and you have very strong emotions, basically, is they have an unstable sense of identity, because a stable sense of identity is developed by virtue of you feeling a sense of who you are in the world. The world is stable. This is who I am. If the world is unstable, you're constantly questioning who you are and wondering who you are, and thus experimenting. You're unhappy here, so I'll adopt a completely different sense of identity. Like Matthew Collins from Hope Not Hate, who used to be a National Front and British National Party activist, and now he spends his life opposing the British National Party, and he's an anti-Nazi. Well, this is that kind of personality, mentally unstable person that has a disturbed sense of identity. Now, with Boris, you have this fascinating thing that when he was a young man, he wasn't Boris, he was Alec. He was Al. He was Alex. And then at a certain point, perhaps when he went to university, he decided he'd be this creation of his own, which is Boris, which is the Alex was this boy that was deaf and was quite introverted and all this sort of thing. And then Boris is this creation of himself, this affable chap that tends to be stupid and isn't, and there's this jolly japer. That's his false self. That's what he's done. That's what he's created. So he's high in narcissistic traits, and so you wouldn't expect him to feel guilt, because guilt is what mentally stable people feel, and that's not what he is.
How is it? Tell me your view, Professor, if you will, on the juxtaposition of the puppeteers, if you will, World Economic Forum, UN, World Health Organization, all the things that really run the world. And you're dealing, and it seems to me these people, if they have no moral compass, and it would seem to me that most of them don't, does that make them easier to control? And I include King Charles III in this. These people seem to be always being manipulated by the unseen. The Klaus Schwabs of this world, the Lord Rothschilds of this world. It always seems to be a manipulative thing. Are they easily persuaded into these that's subjective things?
I think that's a very important point. So if you are a narcissist, so narcissists, people that have narcissistic personality disorder, they are low in agreeableness, i.e. they are they have high levels of psychopathy. They're low in agreeableness, low in genuine empathy. They are they're high in neuroticism, so they're mentally unstable, basically, beneath the surface. And this is why they've created the narcissistic false self, which means they can be triggered and things like this. And they are high in extroversion. And what they crave is narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply. And this is the problem. This is their undoing. They crave, they need in order to feel good, and they will go where they can get it. They want people to tell them they're great, that they're wonderful, whatever. They crave narcissistic supply. And so this someone giving you £107,000 of freebies, and you being able to say to your wife, look, here's £35,000 of clothes, darling. Oh, and your darling, oh, thank you. This is getting narcissistic supply. Okay, having an affair and having a child via the affair, and thus feeling that your life is part of some 19th century novel or something, and that you're special and amazing. This is narcissistic supply. And so to the extent that these people can give to these kinds of public figures, these kinds of politicians, narcissistic supply, then they can be manipulated. They can be, you make them feel good, tell them they're perfect, indicate them that they're perfect, and they will be kind of, to a certain degree, putty in our hands. Although they're manipulative of other people, they're manipulative of other people in order to attain that narcissistic supply. And so you can get people that will. So an example would be the relationship between, there's genetic similarity. Like attracts like. So you'll get these conferences about how to deal with narcissism. Is your husband a narcissist? How can you cope with him? What can you do? All this sort of thing. But the problem is that the kind of women that are attracted to grandiose narcissists are themselves narcissists. Often they because they're genetically similar, and you're attracted to genetic similarity because it means you pass on more of your genes, and the brain is 84% of the genome, for God's sake. So you'll get these women who have borderline personality disorder, which I explained to you what it was earlier, and what they fear abandonment, and they create insecure attachments, and they can't regulate their emotions, and so they kind of oscillate between extremes of character, and so they have an unstable sense of self, and they can also, and they can become under deep stress. They can become basically psychotic, or they can become schizoid, or whatever. They oscillate between narcissism and hating themselves. Utterly unstable women. And they will idealize a kind of perfect partner who they'll see as their rescuer, their teddy bear man, their wonderful, wonderful rescuer, and they'll idealize him, but then they'll easily split because they feel the feelings so strongly. If he does the slightest thing wrong, and they'll suddenly hate him. And then they'll love him again, and then hate him. You have this sort of a cycle of feelings, and they'll feel anxiety about being abandoned, but anxiety about being overwhelmed because they associate love with abuse or abandonment or whatever, complicated stuff. But they will be attracted to narcissistic males, and they will give those males narcissistic supply. Now, eventually, those kinds of narcissistic males may well abandon them because they're sick of the abuse. But that's what they'll do. Now, the other thing that would be attracted to a narcissistic male would be what's called a covert narcissist. Now, this is mainly females, and their way of doing it is to say, "Oh, I am the biggest victim in the world. I am such a victim. I am such a victim. I am the worst victim ever, and I need to be looked after." And deep down, they feel they are introverts, but they are low in agreeableness, high in neuroticism, and their false self is that they are the biggest victim ever. They are a misunderstood victim, and so they will be attracted to people like that. So these people can be manipulated. And who is going to manipulate them? The most dangerous kind of person, really, the kind of Martin Bormann type, which is people that are not narcissists. They don't care about narcissistic supply. They don't care about being praised. They don't care about people thinking they're wonderful and clapping and worshipping them or whatever. They just like power. And they're happy to be unknowns, be behind the scenes, never be famous, as long as they know that they have power. And those are in many ways the most dangerous kinds of people, because you can't manipulate them with narcissistic supply. You can't. They're just utterly power hungry, and they will happily operate behind the scenes, and no one know who they are, but they'll know that they're kind of running things.
That's fascinating, because I'm quite sure that there are names I don't know who are extremely powerful and pulling the strings, and I've sort of been in the game, as it were. So that's where we all know the Klaus Schwabs are on the telly. at the WEF, Davos, and all this kind of thing. But it's my belief that there are people who are much less well known. Oh, yes, and we know, of course, about BlackRock, and we know about all these other sorts of things. So perhaps, I don't know, was it ever thus, Professor? Was it ever thus? Or are we just getting better at spotting it, if you know what to look for?
That's a good point. I think it's probably a combination of both of these. So on the one hand, because of the availability of information, because of the internet, then the degree to which there is able to be a narrative, like the kind of 1990s, there was just the mainstream newspapers. Or otherwise, there was what? There was little magazines with a few hundred subscribers that barely covered their printing costs. So I remember many years ago when I was at school, I was about 15, and I was excited there was an election coming, and I wanted to know about all these different political parties that were going to be standing. No internet. I remember I had to telephone UKIP, and they sent me an information pack, and things like this. Imagine that, with their little
Happy days.
their little magazine and all this sort of thing. And so the first of all, I think the internet means that it's much easier to get in touch with like-minded people, to exchange ideas, to work out what's going on, and thus to question the dominant narrative and to subvert the media dominant narrative, as we're seeing with the current issue about the speculation on, shall we say, on the idea that Keir Starmer has on, or as it's been put, the speculation about the size of his family. Whatever. That couldn't happen so easily before. I mean, the reason you can work that out is that I can just go to the website of the GRO and go through the birth records, and that's all that Guido Fawkes has done. Now, go back in the old days, you had to go in person to St Catherine's House in Holborn, and you had to get the books, go through the books, pay your £5, wait a week, get the birth certificate sent to you. It was a serious effort. So that's the first thing. I think the internet has probably changed things. I think secondly, there has been a sort of polarization effect, in part because of the internet and the ability to get to know people like you so much more easily. You go back to the 90s, you had to rub along with people that had different political opinions from you, because that's all there was. There was just the people where you lived. And now you can get to know people all over the world and be friends with them online. And so this creates a sort of polarization effect where if you are opposed to, let's say, a particular kind of politics, then you can get together with other people and you can dig through the internet and you can find out all sorts of stuff. I think the third effect is cognitive stratification and meritocracy. And what that means is that, as I said earlier, it is much more the case that it is people like and increased levels of education as well, which creates elite over promotion and a sense of entitlement on the part of people that have degrees. They're part of the elite and they have the ability to get into the elite and get into parliament. And so this creates a high degree of competition for a fixed number of elite places in the case of MPs. And so the competition is more intense. And so who is going to win that competition? It's much more likely to be people that are dark triad and combining that with high IQ, and related to that, then I think just the increase of democracy, like the breakdown of things like the House of Lords. What you had there was people that got into those positions not because they were highly ambitious, but because it was the sense of noblesse oblige, that you go into that position because you just do, you're born into it, or that seat has been in your family for many generations, and so then there's this sort of deference to social class, and those people aren't necessarily going to be high and dark triad traits. And similarly, even perhaps with the trade union movement, you've got to think to yourself, well, who are the kind of people that would have ended up as Labour MPs? Well, it would have been trade union leaders. And I bet that those kinds of people, you could argue, they were more kind of based in the real world. They'd suffered, they'd gone through things, and so they probably had less of a sense of entitlement, perhaps, than the sort of middle class lawyer that's been to private school that now dominates. And that's another thing, actually. The people that have been to public schools, at least in my generation, they kind of suffered. They were part of the upper class, but they've been sort of beaten and stuff. Whereas the people now, if they've just been to just day schools, they have all the good things about being rich, but none of the bad things. So I think it's this combination of factors that has made it worse now than it probably used to be. combined with the fact, of course, that we are, as I've said in other research, we are becoming less intelligent, and also on the left, we're becoming less intelligent more quickly. Because when you control for intelligence, the big which is 80% genetic, the big predictor of fertility is that you are conservative and religious, and that this is at 60% heritable. And the big predictor of sterility is that you are atheist and you are liberal, i.e. Keir Starmer types. And so the left are getting stupider more quickly. I call it the Rayner effect. And so or perhaps and so this is another fact. And stupid people are more corrupt and less moral.
Well, they seem to get caught more easily, don't they? That's the point. If you're going to put your hand in, I mean, I worked for an investment bank for years, a very posh investment bank, and I certainly knew how to write out my monthly swindle sheet. And damn clever I was at it too. I wasn't caught out in these matters. So when I was in Hong Kong, if I took my mates in a junk and we all sailed round the harbour drinking, I'd put all their names down as top brokers, of course, for sort of entertainment.
But I think that's
I had an audit trail.
Yeah, but that's built into the system. Everyone understands that in that kind of system, there's going to be a degree to which people are going to take advantage of it. And the important thing is that you don't take the piss. And
exactly.
There's a kind of gentleman's agreement that you understand what taking the piss is. Putting a few pints on expenses, that's all right. Putting bottles and bottles of champagne, that's taking the piss.
Exactly.
Now that I suppose the problem is that people, if we've got more and more of these narcissistic types that are more and more entitled, you've got to think of like a psychological balance between intelligence on the one hand and these personality traits on the other. And if your narcissism is sufficient, that the negative sides of it, i.e. entitlement, feeling that you're impervious, feeling that you're perfect, if your narcissism is so extreme that it outweighs the positive sides of your intelligence, then you're going to get caught out. So it's that balance. Like a good example is, so think about like geniuses. What are geniuses, like scientific geniuses? What are they like? Well, if we go back to that paper I mentioned earlier, Felix Post, Creativity and Psychopathy, a study of 291 great men. They have dark triad traits. They have all of these negative traits: narcissism, psychopathy, whatever. Right? The very, very negative traits, which means that if you are low in agreeableness, then you don't care, or you don't understand because you're too autistic, or you just don't care that your new idea is going to rock the boat. In fact, you might quite like rocking the boat and stirring people up. You might quite enjoy it. If you're low in conscientiousness, then you can think outside the box. You're happy to break the rules. You can make connections that other people will regard as unthinkable. If you're high in mental instability, then you're going to be like thinking all the time. You're going to be generating thoughts all the time, and you're going to have a strong desire to make sense of the world, so it's less anxiety inducing. So these are traits normally that are associated with a lack of success, with low socioeconomic status. But if they are taken together with extremely high intelligence, then what you can get is a person that comes up with some amazing, groundbreaking, original idea that is a genius. Now, if that balance is a bit off, is a bit wrong, then perhaps that kind of person ends up being a criminal, or ends up being a sort of a hippie, useless waster that's creative but just does like bad art. It's not very good. If that balance has to be exactly right. And so I think what we're seeing perhaps with these people, particularly as we are becoming less intelligent, we are selecting against intelligence. And we are selecting positively for some kinds of dark triad traits. For example, people that have borderline personality disorder are more likely to have children because they take sexual risks, so they get pregnant by accident, and then those genes are passed on. So what we're seeing is that the balance is not quite right, perhaps for that reason. Partly, and therefore they are being caught out. But I don't think it's just that. I think it's the ability to obtain information. So, for example, that lie that he told, the reason that I had to stay in Lord Ali's house was because my son was doing his GCSEs. Right. Well, without the internet, it would have been so much more difficult to catch him out on that. But of course, all you had to do was go online, work out what the period was in which the GCSE exams were being sat, work out that it wasn't congruous with when he was saying it was the case. So the internet means it's much more difficult to get away with these things.
Winding up, then, it's fascinating talking to you, as it always is. Just one thing, and you might have your finger on this particular button, I don't know. I'm going back a year or two now, but I did see some fairly convincing graphics that we saw a double step down in the national IQ post 1918 and post 1945, where one might argue, and I don't know, it's outside my field of expertise, that you lost. It's almost a culling in 1914-18 of the very best of all ranks. And again in 1939-45, for example, bomber air crews, which had mortality statistics in line with First World War subalterns in 1914-18. And you can see the step down. You lost, as it were, your seed corn. And the graphics I saw were quite definitive. But is that wrong? Is there any merit in that
no,
view?
it is. I think it is definitely true. I don't know about World War II. I'm not sure about that, but certainly I've got a book where I talked about this. But World War I, the death rate among the troops overall, the death rate overall was 8%. 8% of people that went out to fight were killed in England, on the British side and on the German side. Among the officers, it was 12%. And I think among the German officers, it might even have been 16%, but certainly 12% among the British. So the officers are more likely to be killed. Why? Well, because they're leading the men into battle. Who is more likely to become an officer? Well, at that time, if you'd been to a public school, you were automatically appointed an officer after training. Now, the intelligence, which is, as I said, 80% genetic, correlates not only with socioeconomic status of outcome, but socioeconomic status of origin. It's highly heritable because intelligent people marry other intelligent people in order to pass on more of their genes. There is a degree to which it is true, whether you think it is nepotistic or not, that people that have been to public schools are going to be more intelligent on average than just that they are. And they are more likely to be killed because they're the officers. And then who are the people that are going to be promoted to being the officers who've been to grammar schools or whatever? They're going to be the more intelligent ones often. Intelligence is going to predict being promoted. Intelligence makes you a better leader. Intelligence makes you more organized. All of this sort of stuff. So it's going to be the more intelligent that are going to be killed. Intelligence of any rank, intelligence is weakly associated with altruism, with obeying orders, with conscientiousness, and with these kinds of pro-social traits. It's basically weakly associated with being pro-social. You would expect two kinds of people to lay down their lives. One, psychopaths that just love danger, but two, people who are more pro-social, and that's going to be associated with intelligence. And in general, as well, the higher the more of a leadership rank you have. So it certainly seems to be true. And there was a book published in 1916 called something like was it The Death of the Breed? Some Harvard professor, and he argued that this is going to be a catastrophe it's going to be highly dysgenic. And so I think that's definitely true. It would have reduced IQ. And then, of course, the consequence is that women are evolved to want to marry hypergamously. They sexually select for status. At the very least, they want to marry someone of the same background economically as them. They certainly don't want to marry down hypogamously. They find that disgusting. So the result of that in the wake of World War I was a massive spinster crisis, where all of these upper class and upper middle class women had no one to marry, which is probably part of the reason for the rise of the church ladies and the rise of the Votes for Women movement, because you had all these women with nothing, no husbands, and so they got involved in political movements and in signaling and all social signaling and all this sort of thing. And so I think it definitely reduced intelligence. As for World War II, I seem to recall that the late Richard Lynn wrote a paper on this, and he found that because World War II involved less in the way of trench warfare and people running, towards the enemy's guns and taking huge risks. There's less evidence that it was dysgenic. But there was an IQ test given to a representative sample of soldiers in 39 and to a representative sample of soldiers in 45, and it found that the IQ in 45 was lower. But the problem was that the soldiers in 45 would have reflected conscription, whereas the soldiers in 39 would have been professional soldiers to a greater extent, because conscription was only I think conscription only started in 1940. I think I'm right in saying it started.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that could be to do with that. So I'm not sure World War II necessarily substantially reduced IQ, but World War I think certainly did.
Gosh, what a fascinating journey. I think that was most useful. I hope everybody, your viewers and mine, found that useful. I found it useful personally. So I thank you again for coming onto my channel, Professor. And if you look at the bottom of this, you will see access to Professor Dutton's work and his background, and so you can get his books and so on and so forth. And I would recommend you get onto his channel as well and follow him on his channel. I find it most interesting. So once again, Professor, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure to talk to you, Godfrey. Goodbye.
As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research-based, and I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I automatically share it with you. So, surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.